Well, we might be live anyway, so I'm not ready for this podcast, actually. I had to run and grab a third microphone.
Did you have to go and buy a new shirt?
No. This shirt is awesome.
It is awesome. I love it.
We probably are live because it is time, but I'm definitely not ready because I'm plugging in microphones, checking them, and so forth. So,
is my
hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hey.
Welcome, Jessica, to the show. Jessica was our communicator for this week, and we're excited to talk to her. And why don't you guys carry on the conversation, because I'm going to function a little bit more like a producer this week anyway.
Is that a microphone jack in your hand that you're still plugging in?
No, this is actually just my monitoring.
Oh, okay.
Thing.
Oh, well,
So
it's chaos here this morning. For those of you that are not watching, Aaron has a delightful shirt on that's dark green with some, I don't know, brown and some... And every time you wear that shirt, someone says, is that a new shirt?
yeah.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I don't get a lot of people saying, oh, man, I just love that shirt. They're like,
Yeah.
wow, that's a
Yeah.
shirt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's like this
that-
weird neutral comment.
Yeah. I don't know if any...
I don't think it's neutral.
No?
No.
Oh,
I don't-
at least Jessica's honest.
I don't know if either of you guys have read P.G. Wodehouse, who's an English author. He wrote like Jeeves and Wooster, that pretty well-known show. And there's this moment, Birdie's wearing this new suit, and his butler Jeeves thinks it's awful. And so Bertie says, like, but people keep asking who my tailor is. And Jeeves is like, doubtless to avoid him, sir. Just, maybe people don't shop at Eddie Bauer just because of that shirt. I don't know. I like it. I think it's a great shirt. And that's not what we're here to talk about anyway, as much as it's a compelling conversation. So this week, Jessica, you were part of our Advent series, and we got to talk. Well, I guess we got to talk about the Magi is one way of expressing it, but it's actually a little more complex than that, right? Because it is about the Magi. And
it's about the Magi, but the Magi aren't really the point of the story.
I'm hoping that...
Which later I have questions about that, by the way. Yeah.
Magi and Magi are like English and British ways of saying the same thing. I don't know.
We're definitely right.
Saying it wrong. Like, wait. I said Magi, you say Magi, that's fine. I think. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know why. Like, I'm
Magi.
fine. I'm fine with most of your British pronunciations. I'm like, yeah, they're probably right because they invented the language or whatever. This one, I think you're just wrong.
That could be, that could be right. And we butcher some words. What did I say? I said to someone the other day, something about, I like to try new ideas, like throwing pasta on the wall. And they were like, you throw pastas at walls? What do you mean? I'm like, pasta. Pasta, however you say that word.
I think if I was to say it the way that you do, my not really existing accent would come out.
Yeah.
Magi.
Yeah, Magi.
What accent would that be, by the way?
I don't know. Pacific Northwest doesn't really have an identifiable accent
Yeah.
compared to the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
other
what it
than
would be.
pretentiousness, which is what I think of when I think of the Pacific Northwest. I think of that slightly like, like...
What are you saying?
I don't know.
I'm going to come to Jessica's defense. She's not pretentious.
She's not, but I'm saying that what it resonates with
Just
me.
gotta be
I'm
careful what you say.
Like
like Portland type
snobbishness.
feel, like, I just...
Yeah, we're the worst.
Everything I learned is from Portlandia.
It's like half accurate.
It's like people shopping for grains and stuff like that. I
We're
don't
the
know.
worst. Yeah. That's quote of the day. Quote of the day. All right. So, yeah.
So
We should
aside
dive
from
into
accents,
something other than that. I'm actually going to move your mic just down a little bit out of your face
Okay,
since you're.
thank you.
Yeah.
so usually what we do, and you've been on the show before, so you know kind of the format. When I've been speaking, and for those of you that don't come to South, when we say communicator, we mean the person that was on stage at South this week. We usually talk about some of the prep that goes into that. And so I think I asked you, maybe, was it 7 weeks ago, if you would consider teaching in Advent?
Yeah.
And you said, I'd be happy to do that. And so you jumped in, and again, it was wonderful. So thank you so much for being part of our teaching team. But walk us through a little bit like what that prep was like and how you approached it.
Yeah, well, I realized that this was my first sermon in 2.5 years, so it's a slow process. Just not being in the rhythm anymore of doing that regularly. I did, when I was at seminary, took a narrative preaching class out of the Old Testament. So I still have those questions that they teach you to ask, and when you look at the text of like, is this a standalone story? Is there stuff that comes before where it kind of picks up in the middle and you need to make sure you explain that?
Maybe you should give me those questions sometime. I literally I never did learn to preach in seminary, so I just made it up. So yeah.
So it's questions like that of just what's happening, what's repeated. And then it gets into questions like, where does God show up? Where does sin or human need show up? What kind of questions might people be asking that this text resonates with? It helps you think about that all the way through. And then after you kind of think about it for yourself and see what you notice in scripture, then you go to commentaries and see what other people think is happening in the text. So it was a balance of that. And through that process, the two ideas of kingship and worship were really what came through in that, more so than just this is what the Magi did. Matthew, it seems, is telling their story, and they are important to the story. But they themselves are not inherently the point of the story. Jesus is still the point of the story.
Which is true for us, right, as well. Like, I mean, that's the fascinating thing. Like, our life is a lived experience. We are, in some ways, the center of our story. We're asked to place Jesus as the center of our story instead. And that has complications.
Yeah.
And so when you use the word kingship and worship, so kingship, maybe a little bit, you made this beautiful joke about British people, or one British person in our community. I get kingship, I guess, to a degree that maybe some Americans don't.
Yeah, I think we probably treat, and I say this without actually having lived in a society that does have a monarchy, so this is probably a guess. But my guess is we treat certain leaders or public figures more like kings or queens than we realize that we do.
Ooh, unpack. Let's delve into that. That's about like. Do you have an example?
You didn't know that was going to bring us so much excitement and Alex.
I'm just like,
yeah.
Other than LeBron James, who goes by King James.
I mean, that is a good example. Other sports figures, like we were probably hoping to treat Russell Wilson this way as Broncos fans. I don't think that's going to happen.
Let's just not talk about that. Move on.
Tom Brady would be one if, even if you're not really a Patriots fan or a Buccaneers fan at this point, like that was kind of the space that he has occupied as one of the greatest of the greatest.
There is certainly a reverence, isn't there, around, especially around sporting figures.
Sporting figures, other figures in pop culture. Beyonce, we probably
she's a queen.
tend to treat that way. There's, to a certain degree, there's something that they can't do wrong. You will always back them or support them or maybe make excuses for them.
They're certainly polarizing, right? Like, and Michael Jackson is probably a good example of this. Like, there was a time when Michael Jackson was possibly the most famous person in the world.
Yeah.
Like, you could put him almost anywhere, and people knew who he was.
I think it comes down to maybe you're giving your allegiance to that person more so than what else they represent. Like, if you are a Tom Brady fan, you followed him from the Patriots to the Buccaneers. Like, it wasn't really about the team that he was on. It was about Tom Brady.
Yes. So where I think I agree with that. Where I think there's a fascinating difference for us to maybe pursue, because I think while England still has a monarchy, it's very much a symbolic thing now. So it actually connects a lot more with that idea than a traditional feudal monarchy. And I would suggest with what Jesus says about kingship and how he sees it, because so I can think Tom Brady is divine in whatever way. I mean, I don't know. Like I can follow Tom Brady. I can be excited about everything he does. I can believe he's the greatest quarterback of all time. He has no knowledge of who I am, has no ability to ask me of anything, ask anything of me. And so at that point, like, there is no real connection. Whereas in a traditional feudal monarchy, if a king said you do this, you did it.
Yeah.
Like there was no opt-in, opt-out. Like and so you see that like in terms of like the Roman idea of kingship and rulership.
And that was also entwined with a divinity expectation as well.
Yeah, and so if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, a bunch of Roman soldiers turned up at your door and said, Caesar wills that you die. And you did die.
Yeah.
And though it was that simple. And there was like this obligation that went alongside it. So is Jesus and his demand of kingship, and we're getting away a little from the nativity scene and what that looks like in terms of kingship. We can get back to that. When we think of that broader story that Jesus brings and the church's statement, Jesus is Lord, is it like the celebrity kind of kingship, or is it like the Roman feudal type kingship? Is it a different type of kingship altogether? And then like maybe which one do we act like it is in America in the 21st century intrigues me.
Well, let me say a great book on this is the King Jesus Gospel by Scott McKnight.
Oh,
I
nice.
did reference that when I was putting my sermons together as well. And I think it does a great job of trying to pull that into what does that mean for what the gospel is and how we look at it and share it and what that means for the rest of our lives as followers of Jesus. I mean, I think scripture would say that it is a different kind of kingship.
So.
Like in the Matthew 2 passage, when Herod has pulled the chief priests and teachers together to ask them where the Messiah is going to be born, the way that finishes is that the Messiah will be a shepherd of God's people. And that is a very different image of what a king would be. And it's also something that, I mean, if you think about history, most kings don't fall into that at any period. Or most like governmental leaders, even in different forms of government. Like that's not what they do. But this is what the expectation of the Messiah is going to be, or one of the expectations of the Messiah is going to be.
I think it's fascinating. Like Jesus' kingship is, it's not like the Roman kingship, though it has similar demands. Maybe it's very unlike the celebrity kingship. It's very unlike the no relationship, lots of wearing of the right clothing to show that you're aligned with that person, but none of the interaction. And I wonder how often that's become the church's way of seeing Jesus as king.
You see wearing the right clothing. Like you think of all the Christian branded clothing.
As long as you got the Jesus or the right sticker on your car.
Right.
We can date ourselves with the "What Would Jesus Do" movement, which if you're under 25, hopefully you didn't hear about, but it's like that like we've kind of trended there a little bit. Oh, my t-shirt says "Living in the Way of Jesus with the Heart of Jesus." That's as much as required of me. So it's fascinating that there's those different facets of kingship.
I mean, I think we're always looking for someone or something to worship or idolize. And even if it's the correct someone or something, Jesus, we still want to do it on our own terms.
So, and again, like you look like you want to jump in, so feel free to jump in. But it's you can't have a kingdom of your own and worship another king, can you? I would guess, like you something about because I think a piece of language that I've used in the past that has helped people unlock this, certainly helped me unlock it, is when we think of kingdom and our own kingdom, like sphere of influence is a good way of expressing that. I have a family that I'm involved in, connected to, some kids that I'm helping hopefully to grow up well. I have resources, I have a house, I have these different things. Like to a certain degree, I have that circle. And it seems like the implication of following Jesus is to surrender that kingdom to his kingdom. And so I'm then a steward of my kingdom, not a king of my kingdom.
Right.
which is a challenge, like that giving over of something.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the Lord of the Rings and this kingdom
I am
of Gondor.
always thinking about the Lord of the Rings. So yeah, unpack,
Jesus,
like
Tolkien,
yeah,
other stuff. Like this grand kingdom of Gondor that no longer has a king, or at least someone who's claimed the kingship, is run by stewards.
Oh yeah.
Whose job is to be watching and waiting for the king to hand it over when he arrives.
Oh, absolutely.
But when the king shows up, like the stewards don't want to acknowledge that.
Yes.
They go as far as to say, like, no, this is mine. We're doing fine.
But
are you really the king? I don't think we can trust that.
Fascinating.
And then actually, they die, and it's not a problem anymore.
But full
spoiler alert. Gosh.
People have had plenty of time.
So let me just for a second go full nerd. There is this beautiful moment in the book when one of the sons of an older steward says, like, how long does it take with there being no king for a steward to become king? And the reply from the steward is, maybe in lesser kingdoms, a generation is enough. In Gondor, 10,000 generations wouldn't be enough for a steward to become king.
But even that particular character who is saying that,
then changes
that wouldn't
his mind.
even,
No, I want to be the king. I don't want a king. I'm the
Yeah, it's fine when there's a king isn't there, right?
Right.
But then he shows up, you're like, oh, never mind.
And that's fascinating with our own stuff. Like when we think about, like my house. Like if I were to say to someone, I want you to come look after my house while I'm on vacation, I want you to steward it. Well, there's a couple of ways, actually, fascinatingly, that can go bad. One is that they just don't take care of it. They let my cats die, which wouldn't be the end of the world, but they let my plants die. That would be a real tragedy. They just like they leave the doors open. They don't lock up after them. They leave everything a mess. That's like bad stewardship. The other possibility is when I get home, they've changed the locks on the door. They've moved their sofa in and they're sat playing Xbox. And when I try and get in, they're like, "This is our house now." And both of them are equally wrong in the situation. And so I think like maybe in the Western church, we think of like, oh, I'm not going to be a bad steward, but we've kind of started to own stuff a little bit that isn't ours to own, which is a whole intriguing conversation.
So, I mean, Alex already started alluded this question, but I wanted to go back to it, which was surrounding your preparation for the message, because you and I kind of had a comedic little conversation midweek about, man, we don't preach very often and these sorts of things. But you also pointed out, like, I've been assigned this text to preach about the Magi. Like the series is based upon this idea that we're going to go through these sort of more obscure characters in the incarnation or in the Christmas story. And you're like, I'm studying this passage and it's really not about them.
Yeah.
So could you go through maybe your process of, okay, what do I do with this? Where I want to know more about these particular characters, but they're really not the point. And how do I approach, like, you know, what'd you do there when you wrestled through that? Was that a challenge? Did you, describe that process for you in prepping the message?
Yeah, it was a challenge. Because, I was supposed to preach about one thing to my understanding, and what do you do when it seems like scripture's really...
it. No.
I'm too much of a rule follower to just ignore expectations.
Yeah.
I think, the Magi are still part of their story. I think the hardest part was the framing of how do I structure this well so people can understand what I'm trying to say, but also those other points get communicated. Like I said, kingship is a big theme. It's part of Matthew's overall themes about who Jesus is throughout his whole gospel. He set it up from the beginning. This is only chapter 2, so there's not a whole lot of buildup that's happened. But he is doing this comparison between Jesus as the true king of Israel compared to Herod, who is this usurper king. And that story continues throughout the rest of chapter 2 with Herod trying to kill Jesus. The family flees to Egypt. They eventually come back. So I was trying to figure out a way to incorporate the rest of the story, and there was just like that was not going to happen. I did not have enough time. There wasn't a way to do it clearly and still communicate the rest of everything.
Yeah.
And part of Matthew's point is the Magi are the ones who respond rightly. So it's not like the Magi had to be cut out of the story completely. It was just, the point wasn't just to tell their story.
Yeah.
And then the other theme that I just didn't have time to cover was, it's very important to Matthew, who is writing to a Jewish audience, that they know that the gospel is for Jews and Gentiles. He includes that in the genealogy in chapter 1 with mentioning these women who were part of his family history, who were also Gentile women like Rahab and Ruth. One of the most famous examples is the Great Commission, as it's called in Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations. And that continues throughout the whole story that Matthew's telling. But the Magi are another example of that these Gentiles are traveling all this way to worship this Jewish Messiah.
You're like foreign pagan Gentiles are the ones who get it.
Yes.
The insiders don't get it, but the foreign pagan Gentiles, they're the ones.
They're the ones who show up to worship.
Yeah.
The shepherds do too, but they're in a different gospel. So that was also a big theme that was coming out, but I just, didn't have time to also go into that too.
So one more question in the same vein for our listeners. They may say, well, what do you mean that's not what it's about? Like they're there, can't you just make it about that? So the question is, what led you to determine that they're really not the main point of the story? What was the process that you went through to say? So let's say there's someone else out there, and they're like, oh, there's only one point in this text, or like, how do you get to that space?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? Interpretively, so that they can go through a passage and say, oh, here's the authorial intent of this text. How'd you arrive there?
I think it probably goes back to the question.
I'm loving. I'm in the middle. I'm loving this. I'm like, ooh, yeah.
I think it probably goes back to those questions of where is God showing up in the text, and where does sin or human need show up in the text? And yes, I mean, God shows up in the star and like divinely guiding the Magi to their location and everything, and warning them not to go back to Herod. But it also seemed like the key things there were that kingship comparison, which isn't unique necessarily to the story in Matthew. That happens a lot, Old and New Testament, where there's some kind of earthly ruler like Pharaoh in the Exodus story who's trying to do their best to thwart God's plan for his people. But God divinely overrides that and provides an out. Whether that's through Moses in the Exodus or sending Jesus and his family to Egypt to avoid Herod or whatever. So that seemed to be a really key piece. And kind of where the nexus of those show up is where kind of the main message seems to be.
But I think you mentioned wrestling with that, and I didn't know about that pre-hearing you. So what I actually loved was, I love that you wrestled with those implications, and yet when you think about someone listening to
I'm just moving things in your face. No worries.
To a text and listening to someone expand on a text, the Magi are the exemplary characters in the text. So in terms of like for us in our question, like how should I act, which is maybe the implication of a sermon, what is mine to do? They are the only character presented that you can copy. You can't copy Jesus in that text as an infant child in a manger, theoretically. You can't. You could copy Herod.
You could copy Herod.
That would the text would definitely imply that's not the person to copy.
Right.
So they are not the center point of the text. I completely agree, but your sermon definitely did this. Like they are the center illustration of how to act.
Yes.
If you can learn from anyone, you can learn from them. And I think you pulled that out beautifully.
Thanks.
Totally.
In your connection to like what is the cost of embracing a king? Because the implication is worship is some of the cost of embracing a king. And that story stretches back into, I mean, you unpacked some of the journey, certainly months, possibly years of separating from family, separating from culture, hiking up hills on the way to Jerusalem, and finally arriving in this backwater Jewish town. There's definitely not only worship in terms of like the physical posture of bringing a gift and bowing down that we see in the moment, but worship in terms of like a lot of sacrifice over a lot of years, a lot of personal cost. So I think you hit the heartbeat of what we're talking about this Advent, which is really like, actually the Christmas story is both a surprising one and a pretty inconvenient one. If you look at it in just human terms, like it's not convenient to Mary to be pregnant at 14, 15 years old while being unmarried. It's deeply inconvenient. It's not convenient to leave the comfortable shores of wherever they were in Arabia, overlooking oceans, sitting in palaces or whatever, to trek across the wilderness to make it to a town they probably never wanted to be in and never heard of before they left. Like there is definitely some implications to each of these texts and each of these characters' stories that we can learn from. Like and really like central to that is like following Jesus won't always be particularly an easy thing. It comes with some personal cost.
Yep.
Yeah. There we go. That's the.
How's that for profound?
So, and again, we can push into this question as much as you want to, because I kind of asked you and then gave you some space to think about it, and then never followed up. You said something that I loved that I'm still wrestling with. Like you, sometimes when you say you're embracing Jesus as King, and that implies turning up to worship, there is a doubt as to, can I get there in that moment? Like, there's a lot of other stuff going on. So I guess the vague way I'll ask that question was that a personal felt thing for you? Sometimes when you're preaching, you're like, no, this is an implication I can see. So I can try and talk in a sermon about like what it must be like to go through a divorce. I've never been through one. And then sometimes you're like, oh no, that's I've lived that part of the journey. If you want to unpack just a little bit, like what was that for you in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, it was both.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think if the response is to worship, and we do have this idea of, in the American evangelical church, at least, of worship being singing at the beginning and maybe the end of the service. And that's what worship is. And of course, it's broader than that, but that's what we tend to think. And I think we also tend to assume that, well, real worship means that you need to be like into it and happy to be there and maybe like clapping or raising your hand. Like that's the right way to do it. That's like genuine worship, which we could totally unpack. We probably don't have time to fully do that. That would be a probably series of podcasts.
That's not true. What?
And even if, you might affirm or describe it in a different way, that's kind of like our default assumption. But that's just not the reality for a lot of people. Knowing enough about what a number of people in our congregation are going through, we have a big enough congregation that you can make some assumptions that there's probably at least a few people who are experiencing grief, are experiencing financial hardship,
absolutely,
are dealing with mental health issues, woke up on the wrong side of the bed and just would rather be doing something else. Like there's enough things that you can think of to know that there are people who are hearing what I'm saying and going, I guess, but I'm not there. So what do I do with that?
Yes.
And wanting to communicate to those people who are in that moment of questioning whether that applies to them or whether they can get there, that it still does. but also trying to do that in a sensitive way. Because if you're in that moment of struggle and someone is telling you, well, you just need to worship.
Yeah.
The response, like my response typically has been like, great. Thank you so much for your advice. Like that is so appreciated and sensitive right now.
It's really helpful to me to hear that right now.
Yeah.
Just try harder.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's not what I was trying to communicate. Just try harder.
Yeah, there's this great quote by a wise person that said, worship has less to do with how we feel in the moment and more to do with showing up in the first place. Jessica Rust.
That wise thing. Oh, that's
So that's how you framed it this weekend. And I think that was I think a very helpful way of framing it, because it's a drawing forward to lean in, but it's not like a shaming statement either.
Yeah. And it's not that those problems or feelings or struggles don't exist and aren't legitimate. It's not that you have to make yourself feel a certain way in order for your worship to be a legitimate thing. I think God can hold and meet you in those circumstances, and your willingness to show up and try, I think, means more to him than feeling the right way or acting it out the right way.
I've been intrigued by I feel like these two words, the word enjoyment and the word joy, I feel like in our modern society have become synonyms, and they're not. And so we like this story connects in my weird head. I have this distinct memory of going to my aunt and uncle's for a Boxing Day party, English thing, like a after Christmas party, and I remember like driving over there, and I had an ulcer in my mouth, and I remember like thinking, oh man, these parties are always so good, and the food is amazing. And I'm not going to enjoy it because of this ulcer. Like I was just like 8-year-old and irritated, you don't have any perspective. Like it just felt like it ruined the whole thing that I couldn't turn up and enjoy it. Somewhere our expectation, I think, in the 21st century is we should come to worship and get to enjoy it. And that's not the same as having joy. In actual fact, you can come and God can draw joy out of you. You can reflect joy. You can experience joy. And that feels like its place in the biblical writer's thinking is as a practice almost, as an intention, but it's not the same as just coming and saying, this feels amazing.
Which, spoiler alert, if that idea at all sparks any interest, come back this Sunday, because I happen to know a little bird told me that our preacher this coming Sunday will be talking a lot about joy. So
there
you go.
Yeah, it's
carry on.
But yeah, it's just fascinating, right? That's our expectation. Like somewhere I think I've come to church at times or come to worship at times, and specifically, I guess I'm saying sing in worship at times, feeling like I need to get rid of every ulcer on the way there, so I can enjoy myself, and getting very irritated with the things I can't control.
Right. And like, how much does that also depend on just random petty factors? Like, what song does Aaron choose to play? And he's played a song that I don't particularly like. Well,
the weather, the person sitting next to me that can't sing, me that can't sing. Like there's so many things like that could be.
The worship pastor coughing up a lung on the stage.
I think our expectation that everything should be enjoyable about Christian community, about worship, is actually almost like antithetical to what it is to have a king that you choose to worship because he is your king.
So back to this quote, it means showing up. Can you give some examples of, in your mind, what it looks like to just show up? Like,
I mean, the first and most obvious is like
literally
showing up,
actually getting out of bed.
Yeah. And there are absolutely times where you, for whatever reason, legitimately cannot get there to be physically part of a community gathering on Sunday. Or throughout the week or whatever. Like, that absolutely happens. But sometimes that is what it means. It does mean making the effort to get yourself there on a Sunday or whenever your community meets, to be present with brothers and sisters in Christ, to worship God together. I think it can also mean being present, which again can sometimes be really hard to do. Being a staff member on Sunday, like, I usually don't make it in till like 2 songs in, and
Sometimes the worship pastor doesn't either. About 2 songs in, I'm like, wait,
I'm
trying to worship here, right?
yeah. I might be getting a Slack message that something else is happening. Like, we usually sit in the back because more often than not, I need to get up and go do something.
Totally.
So yeah, it's hard to be present. But also making that effort to be present, to focus on what the words are saying, to do whatever you need to be aware of what God is doing, even if you don't necessarily feel his presence.
Yeah.
My personal spiritual journey, at least since I was in college, there have definitely been times where I've really deeply felt God's presence, which is always, wonderful and what we long for. But those are often short times, and they've been followed by longer periods of just not necessarily feeling or hearing anything, but having to move forward in what I know that he wants me to do and how he wants me to live, living in the way of Jesus, the heart of Jesus. And then there'll be a short little period of presence and like, okay, like God is with me, he's still there, like equipping, I guess, for the next sometimes very long season of quiet.
Yes.
How do you find the energy to sustain those long seasons? Personally,
well, that's really hard. And I think those little short seasons of where I do really feel God's presence, they always seem like they come like just in time.
Yeah.
Like it would be hard to keep going, but he shows up in time for me to keep going.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
wow.
good.
And whenever I feel it's a little bit like, oh crap, what's going to happen next?
Oh no. You're like, no, it's so good while it's here.
Right. I think a couple things and I like, for whatever reason, cannot remember the exact verse address, but in John, a bunch of Jesus' disciples desert him, and he turns to the 12 and asks them if they're going to leave too. And I think it's Peter who says, well, where else will we go?
I think it's John 6.
Yeah.
Is that,
And that has been a really key verse for me. If I believe that Jesus is who he says he is and has done what he claims to have done, and I believe that he is, and I believe that he's demonstrated those repeatedly in those times where, I have felt like he's been very present and seen him working very clearly, then where else would I go? What else could compare to what he offers and promises and who he is? Like, even if I'm not feeling it, even if it's hard, even if it feels like I'm going through something that really sucks by myself, I know that he is present and I can trust that his promises are true.
Yeah.
Even if I would really prefer to feel all of the things, the peace and the contentment and the hope and the joy and all those things, and I'm not. So that has been a very key thing.
That's huge.
I think the other thing is just there's value in showing up and doing the things like prayer, like reading your Bible, like showing up to worship, even if it's extremely difficult for you to do.
Yeah.
And it takes everything that you have to do it, and you feel like you should be doing more and better, and you're doing it badly. Like, there will be a time where that's not how it will be. I think things get hard when we think this is how things will be or feel forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it very rarely is.
Yeah.
Sometimes
totally.
it is.
Yeah.
But it's usually not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And continuing to do what you can do to remind yourself of who God is and what is true and what he promises.
Yes.
Like, there will be those times where it's obvious and it feels different. And you do have that joy that you've been longing for.
I think that's so wise. And it's so easy for us, I think, to put like a quality measure on how we read scripture, how we pray, how we engage in different practices. I had this season.
What do you mean by that? Like if it feels good, then it's a better quality.
So feels good
Bible
is part
reading.
of it. Like even just the amount of time you have. Like in one season of my life, I was trying to read through the Bible like 5 times a year. I was reading like 16 chapters a day.
Wow.
And I had space to do that. And I was doing it because a friend of mine was 70 and he was doing it. I was like, well, if he can do it, I can do it. Now, based on that, like no quantity would ever amount to what I was able to do then. I just don't have that much space. So like, is that I took a step backwards, or just I had a season where I was able to do it and somewhere it's still beneficial? And when you think about like, I mean, you've touched on worship a few times. This broader definition of worship is probably like the Romans 12 idea of you're giving your body as a living sacrifice. Like that's worship. There's a surrender to worship that for me, I think is about surrendering an outcome. Like I want certain things. I expect certain things. And I want everything I do to be driven by a good feeling. What you really said with that idea of it's about showing up is like, it's not about following a feeling. The feeling might follow the action, it might, but actually like part of my surrender to a king is surrendering the outcomes that I think are the ones that should take place or the ones that I need to take place or all those different things. And in actual fact, that's not how kingship works, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I have another question about kingship, actually.
I love it.
So one of the things I appreciated is about your message also is and I think I'm a culprit of this, by the way, but I think that I want to always elevate the sort of wooing nature of God for the broken, the hurting, the down and out, that sort of like he's never going to force you. He longs, he loves you. He sort of loves you into the kingdom. His kindness leads you to repentance, all these things, which is, I think is true. And it's beautiful. And a lot of churches have lost that. And that's one of the reasons I love that. But there was maybe my mistake is sometimes to forget that he is the king of the universe. And so I felt like you were leaning a little bit more on that. And it was a little bit refreshing reminder for me, like, no, you need to worship because he's God and he's king. So could you, have you ever wrestled with that sort of thing? Like there's an authority that just demands worship from him. And that's part of what you were kind of unpacking this weekend. Could you expound on that?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I have wrestled with it. I wrestled with it in preparing the message. And I think partly because it is a hard and uncomfortable message. It's not something we necessarily want to hear, that, yeah, your life is not your own. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you are called to submit everything that you have and everything that you are, your body's as a living sacrifice, like in Romans 12, as you were saying, to the one that you believe and claim is Lord of all, creator of the universe, the one who sustains and creates, and who will one day, we believe, return and fully establish his kingdom that we should be longing for. I think part of that is maybe because we, don't necessarily teach on kingdom theology a whole lot. Like, I know I had never heard of it until I went to college and got my degree in religious studies. So we talked about it. But it's also like, that's not what we ultimately want to do. We want to make our own choices. We want to be free to decide what we're going to do with our lives and how we're going to respond and where our money goes and
Have our own kingdom.
And what we do X, Y, and Z. And it's really hard to tell people that that's what they need to do.
Oh, yeah.
Like, even that is what scripture is saying in that passage and all throughout. Like, to be the person to deliver the uncomfortable message of, and you all need to do this too.
Yes.
And ultimately, again, if Jesus is who he says he is, we will all be doing it one day, whether or not we believe that this is
Every knee
who
will bow. Yeah, every tongue.
he says he is.
Yeah, it's those messages that make you realize, like, if everybody likes you as a preacher, you're probably not doing it right. Like,
Right.
which I find super challenging.
Yeah, there was a lot of prayer that went into that of just, okay, prepare hearts to hear this
Yeah.
because it's hard for me to say.
Yeah.
But I think the other part of it is that Jesus is this unexpected king. There is the rulership and the power and the divine authority, and every knee will bow and tongue confess. But he is also the king who has come close. Like,
Oh,
I
that's
brought
so
up
good.
Philippians
Yeah.
2. He did not consider kingship something to be grasped, made himself nothing, surrendered himself to death, even on a cross. He has experienced all that we have experienced.
Yeah.
He is a good shepherd king.
So
who has come
it's
close to
both,
us.
right?
It's
And that's
both,
what makes
yeah.
it beautiful. Like, he demands the authority, and then you give it to him, you surrender, and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad because he is so good.
Yeah, in my
That's
reading,
awesome. That's awesome.
in my reading less than 16 chapters this morning, I part of what I was reading was
Slacker. So
yeah,
I'm just joking.
was I want to say Matthew 12. Was it 12? 10 or 12. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And then he even goes on the next part is, I will give you rest for your souls. Like, it just, and it is a very wooing text. And so the same God, the same Jesus that can command the stars to tell a bunch of Magi from the other side of the continent to come and worship, can also say something like that.
So good.
Is pretty compelling.
That's good. Well, we're approaching 50 minutes,
Look at us go.
and we fumbled through the first few minutes because I was not ready, but I apologize. But I did want to give you an opportunity. So, like, so whether it's someone who listened to your message Sunday or they're hearing it, after the fact through this podcast, what are some, like, what's sort of what was your longing for the congregation as you were prepping this message? I hope that fill in the blank is the outcome for someone in this space. Could you unpack that a little bit briefly?
Briefly. My hope was that people would be able to catch a glimpse of both the bigness of God and the nearness of God and be moved to worship.
I love it.
That's awesome.
That's profound.
Yeah.
A delightful
On that
way to
note,
finish, yeah.
well,
On that note, I want to complain about this sofa again briefly, but as we close, this is the most uncomfortable sofa.
it is
I've
so
ever sat on.
bad. It's so
But
bad.
we are a Red Couch.
We are
show.
committed to this sofa.
You
We
can't
will.
change the name again.
We might find pillows or something to make it a little bit easier, but we are committed. We're suffering for Jesus for you guys out there on the podcast land.
But Jessica, it was delightful to have you with us in the comfortable chair.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This chair's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm longing to get my chair back, but it was worth giving it up to have you.
You don't get it next week either.
Or the week after.
Or the week after.
You just have to suffer.
Oh, man,
Maybe if
I'm
you're
weeks away.
Maybe if you're lucky, you can be holding a little baby and not be on the podcast at least one of the times. That sounds delightful.
That child is coming at some point.
That's right. Well, thanks for tuning in. If you have questions or if you've wrestled with some of this yourself, like the authority of God versus the tenderness of God, or this kingship idea of like these sorts of things, then drop us a comment or something that's helped you through that process yourself in the comment section. We're still looking for some of you fans. We keep hearing from you fans, and then no one rates our podcast. So that's okay. We just don't believe that you're actually fans until you rate it.
Until you rate the podcast.
I'm just joking.
I'm still planning on
I'm trying to guilt
loads
people.
Of fake accounts to rate my own.
Well,
podcast.
You're not very good at it because there's still only a few, so you need to get on it. But thanks for tuning in. Any final thoughts? Any final words? It was profound enough.
No.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in. We love you all.
See you guys next
week. We
week.
will see you next week if I can figure out how to turn